Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming out to today's program. It's great to have you all here. We have an hour, and that's not a lot of time, so I'm going to get right to it. Today, before we talk about your project in this book, I want to jump right to the end, because the 13th of the 13 Liberty documents that you write about is Ronald Reagan's Tear Down This Wall speech. Today is the 30th anniversary of not the actual physical fall, but the opening of the Berlin Wall. So I wanted to start actually with number 13, and we'll work backwards from there. So can you say a bit, first of all, about the content of the speech? You know, everybody knows about the Tear Down This Wall moment, but can you talk a bit about the context, and then we'll talk about why it's in the book and go backwards from there.
Okay, I just want to, before I do that, I just want to explain that this book, Give Me Liberty, A History of America's Exceptional Idea, is a collection of 13 instances where Americans have considered liberty, spoken about it, fought for it. And it starts in colonial times, and the last one, as you said, Gretchen, is Reagan's 1987 speech at the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was a kind of frozen artifact of the Cold War. It existed because the victorious powers in World War II, which were the Soviet Union, Britain, the United States, and also France, they had made an arrangement to occupy Germany and divide it up into zones. Each country would have its own zone, and they applied that same division to Berlin, the capital, even though that was in the center of the Soviet zone, which became East Germany. The zones of America, Britain, and France became West Germany. And then during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the Western world entered into a long period of rivalry, Berlin is marooned within Eastern Europe, which has become a Soviet domain. Treaty obligations kept the western half of it free, but in the early 60s, the Soviets and the East Germans were facing a brain drain, a drain of people crossing from East to West Berlin, so they surrounded West Berlin with a wall. The most dramatic part of it went down the center of the city. I don't know if any of you saw it when it was up. I did. I went through it on a U.S. Army bus. It was part of a tour of NATO for journalists. We went through Checkpoint Charlie, and it was Cold War ballet. You know, the treaty allowed the occupying forces to send vehicles to each other's zones. So this American military bus could go into the East German zone. It stopped at the checkpoint, even though that was not required. Then the East German soldiers walked around it. They were not allowed to get on. They didn't try to get on. The U.S. military personnel took off their name tags because the East Germans had no right to know who they were. You know, they'd look in the windows at them, but they weren't allowed to see their name tags. Then when this ballet ended, then the bus went on. And that was kind of the odd stasis that Berlin was subjected to. And at the same time, people were still trying to get from east to west. By 1987, when Reagan comes there in his second term as president, 137 people have been killed trying to get across. It started at the very beginning when the wall went up, and it kept going in dribs and drabs. And, you know, 137 people would be a slow day's work in a concentration camp or in the Gulag, but there was something particularly revolting about it because it was happening in the center of a city, what had formerly been a great world city, and these people were trying to move a few blocks or a few miles and being shot down or otherwise killed.
And doing nothing else, just trying to move a few blocks.
Just trying to move.
Just trying to be.
Right, not taking state secrets, not with suitcases full of gold or anything.
Not fleeing the police, nothing like that.
No, just trying to get from one spot to another. Reagan had been an anti-communist all of his adult life. He had, even when he was in Hollywood, there had been labor troubles with communist-dominated unions. He was once given a pistol to protect himself when he was a labor leader from such people who threatened to fix his face, that is, with acid. So Reagan knew this particular enemy intimately in his own life. And then as he becomes a politician, this continues to be part of his program, one of his issues. And then in 1976, after he's lost his effort to get the nomination from Gerald Ford, he has a meeting with Richard Allen, who's a foreign policy intellectual who wants to work on his next campaign. And Reagan tells Allen, well, my strategy for the Cold War is very simple. Some would say it's simplistic. It is we win and they lose. What do you think about that? And Allen, we know this because Allen recorded it in his memoirs. So Reagan runs yet again in 1980. He wins, and this is a goal that he has in mind and pursues in many different ways. He embarks on a strategic defense initiative, which is going to, he hopes, bankrupt the Soviets in their efforts to try and penetrate it and go far beyond their computing skills. He foments dissidents within the Soviet Empire. He picks off low-hanging fruit. There's a communist coup in the island of Grenada in the Caribbean, and then we intervene to overturn that. And then in 1987, he makes his second visit to Berlin. He'd gone in his first term. And he's already been talking with Mikhail Gorbachev, who is the new leader of the Soviet Union, and seems like a new kind of leader, not just a different person, but a different sort of a person, because Gorbachev is talking about restructuring, perestroika. And Reagan wants to see, well, what does this mean? How far does he intend this to go? And it's at the Wall, he plans to deliver a speech. And the main speechwriter is a man named Peter Robinson, who is actually an old friend of mine. And Peter was young at the time. He was 30 years old. A lot of the Reagan speechwriters were young. His boss was another friend of mine, Anthony Dolan, who was, I think, 38. So anyway, Peter has the assignment to write the speech that the president will give at the Berlin Wall. And he comes to Berlin ahead of time, to scout it out. And he's meeting with Berliners. And he describes a dinner that he had. And one man says, my sister lives 20 miles away, and I haven't seen her in 20 years. She can't get from there to here. Another man says, I go to work every day, and I pass a guard tower, an East German guard tower along the wall, and there's a soldier up there. And I feel like he's the zookeeper, and I'm the animal in the zoo. And then one woman said, if Gorbachev is serious about what he's saying, he can come here and tear this wall down. And that lodged in Peter's mind. And in the draft of the speech, he kept, how do I say this? And he put it through variations. At one point, he had it in German. Herr Gorbachev, machen Sie dieses Tor auf. Imitating John Kennedy when he spoke at the Berlin Wall and said, Ich bin ein Berliner. So he had this German phrase. And then his boss, Tony Dolan, said, what did you do that for? And Peter said, well, he's speaking to Berliners, he should speak in German. Tony says, no, when you're writing for the President of the United States, you give him his best line in English. So then the line became, Mr. Gorbachev, come here and tear down this wall. And what's interesting is that the State Department and the National Security Council tried to get that line out of there.
To soften it, to make it less confrontational.
Yeah, and they kept, because negotiations were going on. I mean, it wasn't, an off-the-wall criticism, but, they wanted to soften it, and Reagan said no. And the final push was when he's in the car going to the speech, That's the last time they say, can you tone this down?
It's one of the benefits of being a second-term president.
That's right. And he says, well, the boys at State are going to hate me for this, but I want to say this. And I want to say this to people on the other side of the wall who are going to be hearing this on Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty. I want them to know that this is what we think of this wall. And so it occurs midway during the speech, but it was obviously intended to be the high point. And that's what people remembered. And it played an essential role in the process by which Eastern Europe was freed only 2 years later.
So let me ask you this. Much has been written about the significance of that speech and what effect it had, and people have argued right and left about the contribution that it made to ultimately ending the Cold War. But that's not what I want to ask you. What I want to ask you is, why is that speech one of the 13 episodes, I think is the word you used, episodes of American Liberty? Why is that about us?
Well, the 13 episodes and documents that I focus on fall in a few clusters. Some of them lay out principles for the first time about particular liberties, or the Declaration of Independence really bundles a lot of them together. Others are about plugging gaps, because men are not perfect, they're far from it. There have been many instances where we've forsworn liberty, ignored it, trampled on it. I mean, my argument is that we keep coming back and we're dedicated ultimately to achieving it. But there are failures. The most obvious one is slavery. Another one, very obvious, women had no right to vote until the 19th Amendment nationally. Then there are 3 episodes that have to deal with foreign policy, and that, why that? This is a book about liberty in America, but America is always part of the world, and the world is never far away. So the 3 that I picked were the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted that there would be no more kings in this hemisphere. Europe will do what it does in Europe. We'll be sympathetic to liberty movements there. We won't intervene. But in this hemisphere, no more kings. The Spanish Empire is broken up. We don't want it brought back or some imitations set up. So no more kings here. The second instance that I picked was Franklin Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat in 1940, where he told the country that we would not let Britain go down. We would do our best to see to it that they survived the Nazi onslaught, because as his chief of naval operations told him, Admiral Harold Stark, he said, if Britain wins, we could win everywhere. If Britain loses, we might not win anywhere. And they know war is coming. But until it gets there, we are going to be the arsenal of democracy and supply Britain. And then this is the third. It's not saying we are going to rush to the defense of liberty everywhere in the world, but that in this part of the heart of Europe, the post-war stasis between the Soviet Empire and the free half of Europe is not something that we will tolerate forever. And Gorbachev is saying that he wants to change things. Let him include in those changes tearing down this wall. And that was a message both to Gorbachev, but also to the people of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
So there are several of the documents that you include, and certainly more than I'm going to just list here, really talk about an assertion of liberty on behalf of others. In other words, there are moments in this book and episodes in American history where people are asserting liberty for themselves.
Right.
Declaration of Independence
Sure.
is probably the canonical example. But there are a couple that are noticeably about Americans asserting liberty for other people. The Tear Down This Wall speech, I think, is one of those. I would also include the Monroe Doctrine and the Flushing Remonstrance, which we will talk about just mostly because it's fun to say Flushing Remonstrance, but for other reasons as well.
We both had to look it up.
To find out how to
I was
pronounce.
saying remonstrance all the time I wrote this book, because the verb is remonstrate, right? But then went online, remonstrance.
So we're going to pronounce it correctly today. So I wanted to ask about that. I mean, that's a noticeable, as I said, I think you could characterize others of the documents that you've included as being like that. And I just wanted to ask you to comment on that. I mean,
well, it's because it isn't enough just for me to have liberty. You know, let's take an extreme case. You couldn't be the only free man or woman in a society that was tyrannical. You know, that would mean you were living the life of a spy or some sort of weird exception. I mean, liberty is personal. I'm talking about the liberty of individuals, not the independence of countries or the liberty of a government that has overthrown old customs in order to work more effectively. I'm talking about the liberty of individuals, but it has to be plural. I mean, my liberty is yours. Our liberty is everybody's. And if the realization in many of these documents is that if these people are denied their liberty, that is also a reflection on us and a diminution of ours. So we have to take a stand on their behalf.
And do you think that idea, the idea that the American notion of liberty, because what you're writing about here is not just liberty in general, this is an American notion of liberty, that is an essential piece of it. I mean, I take that from your book, that part of the essential notion of American liberty is that we have to keep expanding it, and we have to sort of keep throwing the blanket over other people.
Well, yes, in foreign policy, you have to do this prudently, you know, because this can conceivably cost blood and treasure. When Roosevelt gives the arsenal of democracy fireside chat, that's not a one-off. I mean, he's doing that in the context of already years of planning. He has put 2 new men in charge of George Marshall, Chief of Staff, Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations. And these are people who see the threatening world the same way the president does and are going to work on their services to get them ready for this crisis. He brings 2 Republicans into his cabinet. Harold Stimson, Secretary of War, he had worked for Herbert Hoover, you know, the man Roosevelt beat in 1932. And then the Secretary of the Navy is Frank Knox, a Chicago newspaper editor. He'd been Alf Landon's running mate in 1936. So this is really reaching across the aisle. But those 2 men saw the world the way Roosevelt did, the world situation. I mean, not domestic politics, but the world situation. So Roosevelt wanted them in on his team. So he isn't only expressing a sentiment. I mean, he is expressing a sentiment and a principle, but he's also making plans to make that real, to try to make that real. So in expanding liberty around the world, it's always very important to keep that practical dimension in mind.
So I started in a strange place because of the day it is. So I want to go back to some basics about the book and about the project. You've written many books, biographies of the founders, books of history, you're a journalist. There are a lot of things you could have written. Why this project right now?
Because I think liberty is a little bit forgotten. You know, the din of politics now is not about that. We talk a lot about nationalism, and it can get very fevered on both sides. And so I wanted to step back and say, well, all right, let's talk about nationalism. This, I think, is the definition of ours. America's concern with liberty has been something we've been working on for 400 years. I mean, it doesn't just begin with the Declaration of Independence. It's older than the country. Americans have been thinking about this, yearning for it, in many cases sticking their necks out for it, back to the 17th century. And it goes right through at least to 1987. And I wanted to get people's attention focused on that rather than some of the other things that are clouding our view.
In the sense, focused on that in the sense of returning people to core values? Or I guess I'd like you to explain a little bit more. What is it that you think they need to be focused on?
This is what makes this country unique. I mean, I say in the book, this is why we're different from Canada and Mexico. And then someone asked me, well, what about Canada? And you know, I've done reporting on Canada. I went there several years ago to do a big political piece. I went all across the country. I like Canada. I like Canadians.
It's a very nice place.
Yes, I do. They don't have a First Amendment. They don't have a First Amendment, and they can lean on you hard. Now, Canadians are nice, so they tend not to. I think Canadians are neurotics and Americans are psychotics. But they don't have those protections. They don't. That is not part of their history. And another thing that's not part of their history is they didn't fight for what they have. It was given to them as an imperial arrangement, largely, I think, because Britain was afraid of the increasing power of the United States to the south of their North American possessions. So that creates a different country. That creates a different psychology. But this is what we have. This is what men and women have argued for, in many cases have died for. And it's not self-perpetuating. I mean, we have, I think, an impressive track record. I wanted to make these 13 episodes as broadly based as possible. I wanted different centuries. I wanted different casts of characters. But it's not self-perpetuating. It has to keep being a project. It has to keep being something that is dear to us and something that we have in mind. So that's why I wrote this book.
Well, I want to ask you, you use the term nationalism, and you write in the book that liberty is our nationalism and we should be proud of it. And I wonder, given how controversial a concept nationalism is, are you, and why are you, wedded to calling this nationalism? In other words, you could describe this idea as, in other ways, why nationalism?
Well, I'm stealing a base, obviously, but it's also, I mean, it's also true. This is a defining national characteristic. I mean, it is in the Declaration of Independence, the national birth certificate, certain inalienable rights. It's in the Constitution. The end of the preamble is to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And as I say, it goes back before those documents. It goes back to Jamestown. And this has always been in the mix of American history, and I would argue it is the most interesting and the predominant thread.
Let's talk about some of the documents that are in here. Some will surprise no one: Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Gettysburg Address. I mean, I think any list of essential statements of American liberty would be incomplete without those documents. But then there are some that we can call them a little more obscure. So we've both been excited to do it. Let's talk about the Flushing Remonstrance, which might be the most, perhaps the least known of the 13.
Right. When I go through the list of the 13, that's the one that most people say, what's that? I've never heard of that. It's the second one, and it happens not in British North America. It happens in New Netherland. It happens in New York when it's New Amsterdam, when it's a Dutch colony. And the Governor General of this colony, he turns out to be the last Dutch Governor General, is a man named Peter Stuyvesant. And there's a statue of Peter Stuyvesant in the park that's out my window in Manhattan. It's a great statue. He's standing there, and he's got a long walking stick that he's gripping. And he has a peg leg. He had an injury in one of Holland's colonial wars. And he looks smart, he looks capable, and he looks like you never want to cross this guy. And that's what he was. He was a very efficient, effective Governor General, and he was also a tyrant and a bigot. You know, it was his way, and it was his way religiously. He was a minister's son. His father was a Dutch Reform minister. To Peter Stuyvesant, if you were not a Calvinist, you were lost. and he tried harassing the Lutherans and Jews who were in New Netherland. His bosses, he was an employee of the Dutch West India Company back in Amsterdam, told him to cut that out because they had directors and investors who were Lutherans and Jews. So they said, no, Peter, you can't do that. But then a new religion appeared in his domain. These were Quakers. And there were no investors or directors of the Dutch West India Company who were Quakers, so he had a free hand. And Quakers then, they were a brand new Protestant sect. They were very countercultural. They would not recognize rank. They would not use titles when speaking to you or to each other. They wouldn't doff their hats. Men and women could preach equally because they believed anyone had equal access to the inner light. And they would preach in the streets and tell people the world was about to end and they had to understand this. So they begin arriving in New Netherland. The first ship that comes in, Stuyvesant meets the captain and he tells him, keep sailing. This man leaves 2 women behind who begin preaching in the street. Stuyvesant has them arrested and escorted out of the colony. Then there's a third man who comes preaching. Stuyvesant arrests him and begins whipping him, having him whipped. He almost whips him to death, and he only stops when someone sends him an anonymous letter saying, can't you let this poor guy go? And so he finally lets him go. Then he decides, all right, no more Quakers here at all. Any ship that comes in with them, it's going to be penalized. No one can harbor them in their houses. And then he gets a letter, a remonstrance, a public letter signed by 30 men from Flushing. And Flushing is still part of Queens today. Then it was a village on western Long Island. And they said to Peter Stuyvesant, we cannot obey this directive of yours because we would do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And this is the true law of church and state, and this is the law of God and of the prophets. And the letter goes on in this vein, very biblical language. And it's signed by 30 men, and the most moving thing to me is that 6 of them didn't know how to sign their names. So they just put their marks. But they laid down a marker. And they were telling Peter Stuyvesant this, and he cracked down. He cracked down. The first thing he did is he hauls in the man who drafted it, a man named Edward Hart. And we know how Hart was interrogated because the Dutch keep very good records, and they've survived. And it's like, who told you to write this? No one told me to write this. I was just hearing what people said. Where did you hear that? Well, I heard what the people said. Did you tell this to the attorney general who lives in the town, the legal officer? No, I don't remember doing that. I mean,
Well, I have to say, he's called the Shout.
The Shout.
That's his title,
yes,
the
that's
Shout.
the Dutch name, Shout. But so Hart is just trying to bob and weave, and not admit anything, and Stuyvesant is being relentless, and he does make them all back down, finally. I mean, he brings such pressure to bear that they all crack. But then, when yet another Quaker appears, this time Stuyvesant sends this man to Amsterdam to be tried. He's going to send him, all right, back across the ocean, let my bosses deal with him. And then they decide, they write back to Stuyvesant and say, look, we don't like Quakers any better than you do, but we want settlement in New Netherland, so let's leave these people alone. If they're willing to move here, let them stay. So Stuyvesant finally has to relent. But the remonstrance is eloquent. I put it in because this is before John Locke. We tend to think of religious liberty in America as coming from philosophers, men of the Enlightenment, like Locke, like the people who read Locke, like Thomas Jefferson. And that's certainly a powerful impetus. But this was a statement by ordinary people, uneducated, many of them, who were not philosophers. They were getting it from their own religious beliefs. We must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And that is why we're going to disobey your order about harboring Quakers. And I just find it a very moving statement.
You write about the remonstrators that philosophy did not make the men of Flushing take action, neither did practical sociology. It took God to do that. In America, religious liberty without the force of God's injunction is a discussion topic, or at best, a habit. Do you think, when I read the book, I thought that you thought something similar about all kinds of liberty, not just religious liberty. Then I went back and looked at my notes and my markings, and it didn't stand out as much as I thought it had when I read it the first time. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that there's a religious dimension to this essential notion of liberty?
Well, let's look at Jefferson. He's an interesting case. Certainly a man of philosophic turn of mind. George Will described him as religiously observant but unbelieving. I mean, he was an Episcopalian, he was a vestryman, he would go to services sometimes, but he did actually write his own version of the Gospels. He wanted to decide which of Jesus' sayings were authentic and which had been, foisted on him. And it's so Jefferson. He said it was really very easy to decide. It took me a couple of days, and he had a razor. Right, I mean, scholars sweat over this, but Jefferson, he's got the Gospels, and he has a razor, and he razors out all the things that he thinks are inauthentic, and then he makes his own description of the Gospels. And for Jefferson, he sees Jesus as the greatest philosopher that ever lived, the greatest moral teacher. But he's a man, like all of us. I mean, he's the best one, but he's just an ordinary man. He's not the Christ. He's not part of the Trinity. And yet, Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, he says we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And before that, he speaks of the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, he's saying this to say that our rights are not human creations. They are not created by Thomas Jefferson writing them down. They're not created by the Continental Congress, who's asked me to write this document. They're not something we vote up or down. These are givens. They are part of our nature, and they are outside of human control. We can trample on them, but we can never make them go away. They belong to us, and they can't be extracted from us. And I think that is a statement that's so sweeping that I would say that has a religious component to it. Even though, all right, Jefferson said laws of nature and nature's God. Well, in a sense, Jefferson kind of is equating God with nature, but he's putting it that way to emphasize that these rights are out of human power to eliminate. I mean, they can be trampled upon. Tyrants can trample upon them, but they can never be made to vanish.
So do you think that carries with it now a specifically religious dimension? In other words, so the question I'm getting at is, if you worship a different God from nature's God, or the creator that Jefferson is talking about, or you worship no God at all, where does that put you?
Well, there are lots of atheists who defend rights with this equivalent religious passion. I hope they have a religious passion to do it. I hope they don't think that rights change over time, or that they're decisions by majorities, because majorities can change. If they think that, then we're in trouble. I mean, you have to believe that this is something inalterable about human nature.
But so you didn't.
Well, okay, and then certainly I can imagine there are gods and religious beliefs which dispense with rights, which would say, oh yes, they're orders of human being, different castes or different levels of human being. Or, the people who worship this God are better than all other people, and they can enslave or exterminate them as they wish. I mean, one can imagine religions and gods of that sort. But the God that I'm talking about in this book is not one of those.
Excuse me. I'd like to talk a bit about John Peter Zenger, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. So maybe we'll just talk about this briefly. Sure. I like this episode, and I will confess that once I became a lawyer, I lost the ability to distinguish between normal things to think about and things that only lawyers think about. So I don't know, is everyone familiar with the story of John Peter Zenger? Okay, good. All right, it is a weird lawyer thing then. Please talk a bit about this trial. This is late 18th century. Well, you tell a story.
Okay, this is the third chapter in the book, and it's the third colonial episode, and it's also in New York. I confess I'm a New Yorker. I maybe leaned in New York's direction a bit. But this was a trial in 1735 for seditious libel. The background is that New York had a new colonial governor, a man named William Cosby, had been sent over from England to take on the job. Predecessor had died. Cosby dawdled along the way. It took him 6 months to get here. And when he arrived in New York, he said, well, I'm owed my back pay for the 6 months that I was traveling. And New Yorkers didn't like that. And it went before the chief judge in New York, who was a New Yorker named Lewis Morris, and he overruled Cosby's request. So what Governor Cosby did is he kicked Morris off the bench, and he replaced him with another judge named James Delancey, who approved this request for the back pay. Okay, so war is declared between the governor and this powerful New Yorker, Lewis Morris. What does Morris do? He hires a journalist. There are already newspapers in large American towns. Boston was the first to have one. New York has one. Philadelphia, when you go down the coast, you already find a newspaper culture. New York has one newspaper, and that prints all the laws. It prints all the official, pronouncements. That's a source of its revenue. But now, thanks to this fight, there's a second one called the Weekly Journal. And the editor that Lewis Morris finds is a man named John Peter Zenger. He's an immigrant from Germany, and he is a printer, and he agrees to be Morris's mouthpiece. And the Weekly Journal runs attacks on Governor Cosby. They don't name him, but it's pretty clear they're talking about arbitrary power and tyrannical behavior. They also run joke ads. There's an ad for a lost spaniel, and that's about one of Cosby's supporters because, spaniels are lap dogs in those days, affectionate creatures. There's another ad about a monkey, which was supposed to be Cosby himself. So this goes on for a year, and Cosby likes it less and less. And then finally, he throws Zenger in prison. And the crime is seditious libel. And under English law of that time, it was a crime to criticize the government. The theory was that could cause unrest, possibly violence and rebellion. And we don't want that. So in order to prevent that, we will make it a crime to criticize the rulers. Okay, this is the legal theory. So Zenger is allowed a trial, and to defend him, his supporters go to Philadelphia for the best lawyer in British North America at the time, a man named Andrew Hamilton. He was a Scottish immigrant, and he's been...
Not that Scottish immigrant.
Not that Hamilton. But he's been a successful lawyer in Philadelphia for years, and he comes up to argue Zenger's case. And the first thing he says in the trial is that he admits that Zenger published all these articles. And then there's silence in the courtroom. It's like he's given up the game at the beginning, because the only defense in trials for seditious libel would be, oh, I didn't really print that, or it wasn't really about the person who claims to be libeled. We weren't talking about Cosby. We were talking about spaniels and monkeys, and it must have been tyranny in general. It wasn't about him. But Hamilton says, no, I agree. My client wrote all this. And then he proceeds, a brilliant courtroom performance, to argue to the jury what we call jury nullification. He tells them that the law of seditious libel is bad. It comes from a bad period of English history. He tells them that it is the right of freemen to complain of misrule, because that's your only recourse. If you can't complain about bad rulers, then the only next step would be to revolt. So the very thing the law is trying to prevent is the only option that's left if you can't complain. And time and again, Judge Delancey rules him out of order, right? Because he's arguing against the law. And Hamilton will say, yes, yes, my lord, you know. And then he'll go on and make the same point later, or in a different way. He runs rings around Delancey. And it is a powerful statement. It's an eloquent statement. He appeals to the jurymen who are 12 ordinary New Yorkers. He says, you are what jurymen are supposed to be. You're honest and true men, and you are to decide the facts of this case. And it is not just the case of a poor printer. It is the best cause. It is the cause of liberty. Then the jurymen leave the box for a short time. When they come back, Zenger is acquitted. And the news of this goes around the English-speaking world. Zenger himself prints the record of the trial. It's reprinted in Boston and in London. It's attacked in Barbados, in the British Caribbean. It makes a splash. And the effect of it in the 13 colonies is there are no more prosecutions for seditious libel, because people realize no jury is going to convict here. So we're just not going to bother. And the effect of that is that the American press is the freest in the world, and it continues to be so, and is an important factor in the revolution, which is only 40 years later.
Well, if we had more time, I would want to talk more about the jury in that story, but we don't, and I'm already behind, and I want to open the floor to questions. There are folks with microphones here and here, so we'd invite you to ask a question. I would ask that you keep your remarks short and to the point. I think there's a question here on the end.
Very interesting 13 episodes. You wrote episode number 14 and 15. Brings the period since Reagan. In the last 30 years, what would it include?
That's a question I was going to ask. What would be 14?
Well, I'm not going to answer it because I don't want to get into the weeds of contemporary political controversy. I don't want to distract anyone from the message of this book because they're for this candidate or that person or against this or that person. I just want to bring our attention to what I think is the most important thread in our history. And this isn't a book of policy proposals. I'm not going to hold anyone's hand and tell them who to vote for. But I want people to reflect on this aspect of our history and our heritage and hopefully our ongoing history, because we have to keep it going. And I want to inspire people by the example of men and women who did keep it going.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is, when you talk about liberty, the need to expand liberty, that liberty has to be expanded and increased, how do you fit that in with the history that we have of overthrowing governments, democratic governments? I can name just a few off the top of my head. Arbenz in Guatemala, Goulart in Brazil, Allende in Chile, democratically elected governments where we help replace them with dictatorial governments. How does that fit with the notion that we're expanding liberty?
Well, I perhaps said that more than you did, so I'll take responsibility, but you get to answer the question.
Well, of course it doesn't, and many things don't. The worst is chattel slavery, which begins in 1619, shortly after my first instance, which is the first meeting of Jamestown's General Assembly, which is self-rule. But then only weeks later, the first privateer, the privateer the White Lion, came in, and 20 and odd Negroes were bought off it, first black slaves in America. And that, of course, goes on till 1865, and many after effects thereafter. So yes, there have been shortfalls, there have been gaps. My only contention is that liberty has always been an object of pursuit and also something that's been attained over the years. And I want us to think about that because that's the grounds for keeping it.
Over here,
Yeah, 1 second.
on the end.
In the book 1491 by Charles Mann, he kind of makes the argument in his final chapter that the Iroquois nation was very influential in the forming of our government, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the way Native Americans might have shaped our ideals of liberty in this country.
Well, the Iroquois nation being the model for the Constitution is an old story. Benjamin Franklin is really behind it. And he does this around the Albany Plan of Union. This is in the French and Indian War. He hoped that the colonies could have a united forum in which they could coordinate their activities in fighting along with England against the French. And he uses rhetorically, he says, if the Indians, if the Iroquois can have a government that encompasses 5 nations, you know, the Oneidas, the Senecas, the Mohawks, and then the Tuscaroras were the 6th that they added early in the 18th century. Why can't we do this too? There was a man, historian who has died some years ago, Edward Jennings, and he was very pro-Native American. He wrote a book called The Invasion of America, which was about white people coming here. But he always dismissed this Iroquois story. He said it was Iroquois propaganda and white propaganda, and you know, if you talk to the Iroquois' Indian neighbors, they wouldn't appreciate it. Because the Iroquois were very aggressive and expansionistic. So I think, I think American Indians have always been a figure in the minds of white Americans, and it's been a complicated figure. They've been the enemy, they've been the other. They've also been idealized as free and thought of as free. I mean, you can see this in The Last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper's bestseller from the 1820s. You know, so after they're beaten, we idealized them and romanticized them. And it wasn't entirely false. There was a certain element of truth in it. But I think it's a much more complicated story than they were the model for us.
In the back?
I think it does make sense to think of liberty as sort of the underlying animus of the country. But in that context, how does a country deal successfully with the idea that it can't be open-ended and that it needs a sense of balance without destroying the liberty that it meant to protect in the first place?
Well, that is an excellent question, and the Constitution is one of the documents. And of course, a lot of the effort that went on in those 5 months in Philadelphia in 1787 and in the ratification debate for the year following it was precisely that. Will this structure preserve our liberties? Will it keep us together without oppressing us? I mean, the fear of a lot of its critics was, you've created a government that's too strong. One of the most common criticisms of the Constitution was that the country was too big for such a thing. You needed it more like an alliance of individual states, because as countries become too large, they can no longer be republics. And the philosopher who expressed this was the Frenchman Montesquieu, who everybody read. I mean, everybody who was educated and literate had read this man. If you read the notes of the Constitutional Convention, you'd think Montesquieu's first names were the Celebrated, because he's always called the Celebrated Montesquieu when people refer to him. And this is something that the writers of the Constitution, and particularly the writers of the Federalist Papers who are defending it, have to get around. You know, they have to get around Montesquieu's objection. And James Madison is very clever about this, and he he says, well, no, actually small republics are unstable. I mean, they're prey to terrible faction fights and coups, and really you want to have an expanded republic because then it will be harder for a particular faction to take over the whole thing. And he develops this idea at great and very interesting length. So yes, this is a political issue, it's a political problem. The Constitution had no Bill of Rights. Well, a lot of people didn't like that. So there was a tacit understanding that once it was ratified, the first order of business would be to add a Bill of Rights, which Madison makes sure that the House of Representatives produces one, and then the Senate agrees and it's sent out to the states. And you can see these kinds of concerns going throughout our history, and they'll never stop. Because politics is always contention, and people always want things, and people always push back, and people are always going too far and have to be reined in. And so we'll never stop thinking about it. We'll never find the perpetual motion machine where we can just say, we're done. But it is, I would argue, and I would hope, in the service of this larger goal of liberty.
Other questions? Down here? Where's our microphone?
I have one. Where?
Here in the second row.
Thanks. This has been very enlightening. As a migrant and as somebody who's traveled a bit, liberty seems like a quintessential American idea. I mean, I agree with you. It binds us the best. But the question I have is, how do we propagate this? How do we make sure that people understand this? Has it got to come with our education? How we teach our students? How does it happen in our public discourse so that we understand how quintessential this is to being an American?
Well, I wrote this book. That's one.
Your work
little,
is done.
No. That's one little thing, but everything you said. Right? I mean, it has to be education, it has to be discussion, it has to be our own mindfulness. And yes, we backslide, we forget it, we go astray, we talk about it wrong. I know all that. I have to be a glasses half full person. Okay, that's just how I have to navigate through life. And the way to answer your question is to keep at it. And I hope this book will help people do it. I hope it will inspire them to do it. Because these stories, I think they're interesting. I also think they're inspiring. I mean, some of the heroes, some of the main characters are people we've all heard of. Some of them nobody's heard of. Some of them, the only time they appear in history is in this particular event because they signed a document, or because they were on a jury, or because they appeared, they happened to appear. But they stuck up. They did the right thing. And we can all do that. And I just hope that this will inspire us.
We definitely have time for one more question, but I do want to point out that in the book, for the documents that are collectively authored, you list all the people who signed their names. You list all the people who signed the Constitution of the New York Manumission Society, I believe, the Seneca Falls Declaration.
Yes, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, which 1848 called, among other things, for women to have the right to vote. It was signed by 100 men and women. I think, 62 women and 38 men. And I list all their names. And there are 12 of those people of whom we know nothing, except that they were there and signed this.
I really thought that was an excellent decision that you made to include those names. One more question? In the back?
Oh, boy.
Hi. So throughout this entire conversation and throughout the book, you take a definition of what liberty is as a given ideal. Could you give what you would think a working definition of liberty is in this context? Thank you.
Well, I think I began to say it, liberty is the liberty of the person. It's the liberty to have the fruit of your own labor, and it's the liberty to have the direction of your own life, so long as you don't infringe on the liberties of others. I'll start there.
That was a very concise question, and it actually timed out exactly perfectly. Thank you all very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.